Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers of this event, especially Senator Kyle and his staff, and the American Center for Democracy for allowing me to present my thoughts on the subject. Speaking of DITRA, it was the big joke in my office. I'd get a call once a day from somebody, either they knew me or not, and they would ask me at the beginning of the phone conversation how much I'd contributed to reducing the threat that day. So quantification of threat was something interesting. These thoughts are my own, and they don't reflect my company or any of our clients. About 7 years ago, whilst I was the Director of Research for the Advanced Systems and Concepts Office, which was set up by John Hamry in 1998 in DITRA to be an in-house think tank, I initiated a research inquiry at the time to look at what the next generation of weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass effect would be. It resulted in several spin-off inquiries. It was quite an interesting little exercise. The best part of it was I wasn't responsible for implementing any of it, just capturing the thoughts and sending it on down the stream. It's important to note the distinction between WMD and WME. WMD is thought of as traditional nuclear, biological, chemical, radiological, and high explosive threats, whereas weapons of mass effect is a little more social science, squishy-like, which we used to keep the definition that it was non-traditional weapons, including weapons inducing mass terror designed to attack some aspect of society. One study I oversaw in particular, which I enjoyed and really piqued my interest, and I've been trying to follow these last few years when I had the opportunity, was the question at what point terrorist organizations, as we knew them then, as we know them now, might evolve, they and their state sponsors might evolve from creating kinetic kill terrorist actions to attacking the Western economic system. Is it possible that warfare in the future may involve actions either taken by a state adversary or a non-state adversary, specifically designed at activities to damage the U.S. economy and the Western economic system? Our thinking back then in my little group and those that we used to do some of this research didn't evolve enough to take into account the generational changes in offensive cyber and other technologically induced systemic attacks. If anything, as we shall see today from the panel that you're going to hear, this aspect of the problem has gotten much worse. For example, if stealth viruses can be used to attack military systems, defense systems with the purpose to create physical destruction or to cripple capability, then imagine what can be done if these same viruses were turned into the economic and financial systems. So I have but a short time in this presentation, so let me list several observations and make some points on the future threat environment. First, the observations. I'm going to use acronyms EW and ET to stand for economic warfare, economic terrorism, in the interest of time. So first observation, the experts we consulted back in the 05, when we had a little small get-together on the subject of economic terrorism, they were unable to come to a consensus on the aspect of whether it was a real threat, and whether the threat was real. In fact, they were divided. The government experts and the terrorist experts, those who do terrorist research, and we all know who they are, so I won't go into it, doubted that terror organizations had the ability and sophistication to evolve toward economic terrorism as a weapon of choice, certainly not in one generation. However, interestingly enough, the private sector folks, and these people were spread across a number of different industries, felt that they were not only vulnerable then, this was 2005, but they freely discussed their concerns in this Chatham House environment conference I'd set up. Unfortunately, we didn't discuss progress/conduct on the research of state-sponsored economic warfare, simply because it was a little bit beyond the scope of the meeting. Hopefully we'll get into that today a little bit. Next point, the insurance industry experts felt, in addition to more 9/11 incidents, that mass panic-induced psychological terror would not only strain their resources to the breaking point, but it was something they were betting on, predicting back in 2005. In fact, mass terror-induced economic attacks was decided by this group of people, people that look at risk for these companies and decide how much insurance they should have on their own, as the biggest threat they had in the future. We kind of define this as an attack designed to drive human behavior in a massive way that would end up doing some kind of harm to the economic system. Second observation, agricultural industries were especially believed to be vulnerable, that ranging from disease-induced food production to attacks on the supply chain. Next observation, U.S., because it is so big, represents a target-rich environment across the whole front for either ET or EW. Public reaction is the key. Bolt out of the blue attacks would likely have a cascading effect, be difficult for government to manage. It was generally believed that to be successful, a campaign of tactical maneuvers or smaller attacks would be needed because the economy was believed to be too resilient. So the question here would be, again, if this is 2005, these pinprick attacks, would you be able to spot it? On the open source side, that is the unclassified side of gathering information, economic jihad is possible, likely. If it hasn't occurred, given at the time that's taken place in the intervening years, doesn't mean it's not going to happen, and I would say, based on what we can read in the open source, just give it time. Much jihadi literature contains many references to attacking economic symbols and systems. I think Rachel's written about that quite a bit. And lastly, the big observation as a takeaway to this get-together is preparing countermeasures are extremely difficult. More on that a bit later. Now, a few points on the future threat environment. First and foremost, including how to identify targets. The most important part of this, in my estimate, is unless there's a serious and immediate public-private partnership created to work on this problem, we have virtually no way of knowing if what we are seeing coming at us is an attack or a criminal activity, a hacker, a group of hackers that are in it for fun-seeking activity, an anarchistic event for the purpose of creating anarchy, or some sort of cascading technological failure. And as a corollary to this, essentially, as opposed to the sort of mission spaces that we're all used to working in the Defense Department and from my military background, the big question is, who owns the economy? Who's the keeper of the economy in the first place? If some entity attacks private international financial systems, for example, is this a national security threat, or is this their problem? Finally, what's the role of the public? Should they be informed? Should they be educated on the threat and help to provide the resiliency blanket that we all need to look at? The same thing we talked about back after 9/11 with the kinetic destructions. My thinking here is that the government did a pretty good job of educating the American public in the 50s about nuclear weapon use in the United States, and some of that could be useful today. Second, EWT attacks that are kinetic cannot be ruled out, even in a digital age. Essentially, research points to four types of future attacks: traditional kinetic, innovative use of cyber and or spoofing, traditional WMD, and long campaigns combining multiple attacks at narrow targets to prolong economic damage. Third, in an age of cyber, which we're going to hear about later, there are many ways to damage/attack economic/financial systems for kinetic effect, to destroy digital systems, to deliberately steal or divert economic assets, to spoof or obfuscate in a manner that creates panic, loses confidence in institutions and governments and security organizations, and masks real intent. The entire domain of cyber used in this manner as a weapon of EWET is not well understood as a threat, especially for the economic domain. This also includes disinformation campaigns as well. Fourth, it's not very clear, even if an attack is labeled as a bona fide attack, what's to be done about it? What are the motivations and intent of such an attack? Is it an act of war that draws a military response? What exactly is the role of the defense and military forces of this country, for example, in an economic warfare or economic terror campaign? Do we think differently about this if the source of the threat comes from a state? If states either wittingly with helping non-state groups or in a deliberate campaign are trying to undermine our economy? Are we certain that the government of this state is behind it, or are these bad actors? Does cyberspace behavior that includes attacks on economic systems merit some kind of an arms control approach to sort of manage the cyber common spaces? Will that work? And lastly, on that question are these attacks deterrable? Is this something we can reach back into the classic deterrence theory and use as a way of coming up with a countermeasure? Fifth, work must be begun now on a suite of countermeasures that take into account a wide variety of proportional responses and system resiliency. And here, these things need to be exercised at the interagency and at the with our friends from the private sector in order to be effective. And this is one of those learn-as-you-go things. We need to do it over and over again so that we understand what we're facing. Sixth, and I would not rule out in the future attacks on agricultural production in some form, although, interestingly enough, my analysis has led me to conclude that the movement to buy organic, buy local, buy from small farms, at least in this country, may have mitigated some of the food chain vulnerability issues. There are still many threats related to agricultural food animal production, especially from overseas, as well as distribution. Finally, my last point, one of the most important aspects of the threat space is the existing environment, the one we all live in now. If the economy is perceived, either here in this country or across the Atlantic and across the Pacific to our friends in Japan and other the big economies of the G20 states, if the economies are perceived as suffering from a number of failures of various kind, and obviously you know what comes to mind here in the European Union, and may be exacerbated by poor leadership of these countries, then this pre-existing damage and weakness will be part of the attacker's calculus. Well, I thank you for your time, and I look forward for the questions later.